What can I say? I thought it was alright. Well, hello there, and welcome to my totally well-timed, not late at all, completely relevant review and impressions of Star Wars: The Last Jedi. So I recently did a video of the Star Wars Episode 9 teaser trailer impressions, and I kind of gave my general review of Star Wars and this new trilogy and everything in that video, but I admitted in that video that I had not seen The Last Jedi. So being that it's 2019 and Star Wars: The Last Jedi is on Netflix, I thought it might be appropriate to go back and watch the movie and then come and do a little video of my impressions of it to kind of contrast my perception of Star Wars in this new trilogy with actually seeing a little bit more of it than just The Force Awakens. So as I said in that video, I thought that The Force Awakens was terrible. Not necessarily technically bad, but just boring. I didn't like the story, I didn't like the characters, I didn't really like anything about it. It was just kind of boring, the plot was boring, and there was just nothing that really grabbed me about it. Now, I will admit I only watched it one time, so maybe if I went back and watched it, there would be more things that I would like about it. But in any case, wasn't impressed, and really didn't have much interest in seeing any follow-ups to it, because there was just so many things that they laid out that were fundamental, you know, with Rey's character and basically all the new characters and the plot and everything. It just was kind of just rehash and uninteresting, and it just didn't really leave me with much enthusiasm for anything they would do afterwards. However, right out of the gate, I will say this is kind of weird because most of what I've seen is people actually enjoyed The Force Awakens more than The Last Jedi, so I don't know if I'm in some kind of minority here or what, but I actually enjoyed The Last Jedi more. But that kind of comes with a bit of a caveat, because in my opinion, the way I would summarize this new series is it's not Star Wars. Like, that's why I was able to enjoy the movie. At a certain point, you realize, oh, this isn't Star Wars. This is the Avengers in the Star Wars universe. So, like, once you get past that point, once you realize, like, oh, I'm not watching a Star Wars movie. I'm watching a modern day kind of sci-fi action adventure movie that is cookie cutter and follows the mold that Marvel and other similar types of movies have set in recent years, with these types of movies pandering to silly humor and kids and things like that. So yeah, Star Wars is the Avengers in a galaxy far, far away. Now I imagine that's kind of a point that people would perhaps try to argue or contest, the idea that they're somehow different than the originals. I mean, obviously there are going to be differences from the originals. The first movies were made in like the 70s, so like of course there's going to be a big difference, but I think there's just a fundamental charm. Like, there's a certain element of the way stories are told now versus back then, the way characters are developed now versus back then. There are some differences, but you can still kind of tap into the old charm, and you can still do justice to the characters and the themes that you're adding to or remaking, whatever you want to call this series. But one of the things I feel that's different now compared to back then is that the original Star Wars movies were basically an adventure movie set in space. It was kind of like Indiana Jones, but a sci-fi version. Nowadays, you know, all these things have been fleshed out, like every genre you can imagine has been tapped into. So there's these certain kind of templates that they have developed for what this kind of movie is, what that kind of movie is. And of course you have the titans of the industry, the Avenger movies and things like that have proven to be very successful and continuously successful. So when they go to do a Star Wars movie, it seems that that influence is not lost on the filmmakers, and they're going to try to tap into that because they want some of that money. So basically, you know, to summarize my positive experience with watching this movie, I would say it's just kind of a dumb action adventure movie set in space. You know, just kind of ignore that it's Star Wars and ignore that there's any history to the universe or the characters or anything, and just be like, this is a brand new sci-fi movie set loosely in the Star Wars universe, and it's just going to be its own thing, just a modern version of some kind of old ideas, and just treat it as though it's a brand new franchise. And that's kind of my impression of it. That's how I was able to watch the movie and enjoy it. That doesn't mean I thought it was good. I just thought it wasn't boring like the first one. So to get into some of my critiques of the movie, like what I do think they could have done better on and what makes it not Star Wars in my opinion, is the very obvious ties to the Marvel movies. Like the structure of the story, the way the characters interact, the writing, everything about it is very similar to how the Marvel movies are done, and one of the big things is the humor. Now, it's not to say that the original Star Wars trilogy didn't have humorous elements, but I would say that the humor in those movies, and it kind of is the case with movies kind of back in that time in general, is that the humor is generally peripheral. There's not as much focus because the movie's not really meant to be strictly a comedy. It's meant to be an action adventure movie with some comedic breaks. Part of what makes those comedic breaks work is how they happen and who they're happening to, or who's committing the comedic event or actions. Like one of the things that sticks out to me in the original Star Wars movies is like Harrison Ford's Han Solo being like kind of bickering with Chewbacca, and, you know, kind of looking at him with an angry face and be like, laugh it up, fuzzball, and stuff like that. So you kind of have these characters who are embedded in the universe, and the humor comes from their interaction within this world. So what I mean when I say that the Star Wars universe in this new trilogy is kind of copying Marvel is it's a more self-aware humor. It's not as peripheral. They put much more of a focus on it. So like the opening of this movie, besides like the action scene and whatnot, is they're having some kind of weird phone conversation, and he's like punking the guy about whether or not he can hear him, and it's just like a juvenile prank that like a high schooler would play on someone if they were calling him on the phone. And it's like, this is no, it just doesn't work. It's like it doesn't fit in this universe. Like there's very dire things happening, and there's no humor extracted from the characters' interactions in a genuine sense of what is going on around them. It's like literally, here's a serious moment, and then now we're going to break that tension with humor that makes it seem like the characters aren't really living in this moment. And unfortunately, that kind of continues throughout the whole movie. And even more unfortunately, a lot of the gags in the movie don't really work that well. One of the worst ones is when Finn wakes up from his cryo sleep or whatever the hell that was, is like in a medical bay, and he gets out and it's very like slapsticky, kind of like Three Stooges style humor, and he's got hoses and they're all just like shooting off water everywhere, and it's just like, it's so off-putting. And I guess, you know, you could say that the prequel trilogy, you know, the newer Star Wars movies that George Lucas did, kind of had a similar feel, but it's also part of what a lot of people I think criticized about those movies. So it's known that it's kind of a misstep to try and be too humorous, because, you know, in all honesty, I would say the Star Wars universe is pretty ridiculous. Like all the alien types and then the conflict going on and on for years and years. It is kind of a ridiculous scenario, especially after all these movies have come out and it's just dragged on and on. But what can kind of anchor that down and make it work is if the characters actually feel like they are experiencing the weight of the conflict that's happening. And these movies, and this movie in particular, doesn't seem to do that. It's kind of like, yeah, everything's horrible and we're all about to die, but here's a funny joke just out of nowhere. You like the Marvel movies? We're like those guys, you know, we can be funny too. Following up from that is, I think one of the things that makes these movies not work for me and why I don't really enjoy them is I don't like any of the characters. Honestly, there was about 2 characters that I really liked in this movie. One was like the smuggler con artist guy that they met that betrayed them, and the other is Kylo Ren, because they're the only 2 characters that have anything interesting going on with their demeanor and with the conflict and the struggle and the philosophy behind them. Obviously, you know, there's the good guys and the Jedis and trying to fight evil and all that stuff, but that's all very clear cut. When you have the darker characters with the conflicted paths, the conflicted morality, the conflicted ethics, it's more interesting, because especially with the Kylo character, as he's obviously struggling with that. And I think that's something that's a strength for the movie and a strength for his character, is that he's conflicted and he doesn't really know what to do in a lot of these situations, and he's trying to fulfill what he thinks is the right thing to do, but then what he thinks is right is always being contested by the events that he's confronted with. The rest of the characters, especially in this movie, just seem to not have much purpose. There is a bit of conflict with the Rey character, like she's trying to get help, she's trying to figure out what to do to save everybody. And, you know, Luke's kind of being weird and not wanting to cooperate, just she doesn't know what to do. So that was kind of interesting, but there's just like an element, like, I don't know, she's one of my least favorite movie heroes or whatever you want to call her. I just don't really feel like she fits the mold too well. That's just my opinion. I don't have anything wrong with the actress or the character per se. It's mostly the writing, and again, like the comedic stuff that they keep trying to do with the characters. It's like there isn't any real weight to her. It's like, oh, she wants to know who her parents are and stuff, and it's like, fair enough, you know, but like you're facing this huge catastrophe going on in the universe right now, and maybe you should be a little bit more focused. And so speaking of that, then you have the Luke Skywalker character, who in my opinion in this was kind of misused. I don't really have anything against the concept of him being like kind of jaded by this concept of good and evil and the Jedi and whatnot, and thinking that it should end, which is interesting because it seems that he's kind of given up on it. And then you have the Kylo character who's also saying like all this stuff should end. So it seems like they're on the same page, yet they're also in conflict. I don't know, maybe I'm misreading it, but it seemed like more could be done in that regard to add more conflict and drama between the tensions of these characters and their philosophies on what's actually is going on. But instead, it's a clear line of who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, no matter what their actual philosophies are. In any case, you know, Luke is kind of a dark character at this point. He's not really fond of what's going on or having any part in it. And they kind of make him, it seems like an homage to the kind of kooky behavior of Yoda from the original trilogy. And again, it just doesn't really work. Like, Luke had a pretty significant arc over those 3 movies, and now all of a sudden he's gone through some rough times and he's given up on everything, and he's just like disinterested in the whole thing altogether. And, you know, he has to see like Yoda's ghost to turn him around and burn a tree and stuff. And it was just like, you know, okay. But it's just, for the most part, it seems like he doesn't really serve much of a purpose other than exposition for the movie. And his character's role in this story is pretty much just the backstory. Considering how much he's a part of the movie, it would have been nice if he had had a bit more of an effective part in what was going on, at least in part of like his contribution to things, because he's very wishy-washy. And like in one way he's like, no way, another way he goes, okay, I'll teach you. And it's like no matter what he sees, it's just like one no all the time, until finally he changes his mind and then does all the stuff at the end. But it was just kind of like, it just kind of droned on and seemed somewhat inconsistent with his behaviors. Speaking of inconsistency, the plot in this movie was pretty terrible. You know, the whole movie is basically ships in space staying a certain distance from each other, and everyone's trying to figure out how they're going to get out of this particular little situation. I'm a fan of movies that have really simple story setups, but the plot becomes complex. I think some of those can be the best kinds of stories because they're really simple and you can really grab onto what's happening and really then focus on the characters and their experience. But in this movie, it was a very simple plot that they tried to make complex by basically having characters hatch plans that just end up not working. And again, that's fine too, but there's no real sense of weight to the scenario. Like, the struggle of the characters just doesn't seem all that heavy, because partly because of the comedy and the way that it's written, but also because the characters are generally useless. Like, the only one that really seems emotionally affected and have the weight of the world on his shoulders is the guy from the beginning with the prank phone call joke, because he's a fighter pilot and he wants to save people, and he actually seems to be getting stressed out while everyone else is kind of just being stoic or off gallivanting and having confusing good times. And unfortunately, adding to his character's frustration is the fact that the new leader lady, Miss Purple Hair, is secretly devising or secretly executing this plan that she doesn't let anyone know about. And that would make sense, you know, because they're being tracked and they're able to be tracked through light speed and all this stuff. So it's like, oh, they're being tracked, but there's no evidence that they're being like listened to. There's no mole in the rebellion or the resistance, whatever you want to call them. So there's no real reason to be like, oh, I can't tell anyone about this plan that we're executing. We have to leave everyone in the dark. Why? They're tracking your position. They're not listening to what you're saying or your plans. So all they would have had to do to fix that little plot hole is, instead of it just being like someone's tracking their position from another ship, maybe they have a plant among your ranks that's listening. So of course it would make sense that you have to execute this plan secretly so that the word doesn't get out, and the Empire, or what are they called in this, the First Order, so they don't find out what you're trying to do by getting people off of the ship and misdirect them using your bigger ship. But instead, it's just some reason she can't tell him, or she doesn't tell him, and leaves this guy to be sweating it out the whole movie, trying to figure out how he's going to save everyone with this crazy woman doing everything wrong, supposedly. It's just like, it's one of those things, it's lazy filmmaking. You can tell that they wanted this conflict to be there without actually having to set up a reason for the conflict to exist. Again, that's why I say this movie is best enjoyed as just kind of like a dumb action adventure movie. Just completely forget that it's supposed to be Star Wars. It's just a bunch of failed setups over and over and over. And if you enjoy the humor, which I didn't really enjoy much of it, then of course you have some laughs along the way. You have some pretty badass action scenes. The space fights and everything were pretty good. Somehow they actually managed to make explosions not become incredibly boring like in most movies. Like if you watch the Transformers movies, you kind of get tired of seeing the explosions because they're all just the same over and over. So like the technical merits of the film are definitely there, and it's very strong, and the action scenes and whatnot are all very well done. So most of the issues come from the writing and the characters. Speaking of characters doing nonsensical things, you had the moment towards the end of the movie where Finn is gonna fly his ship into the gun to save everyone in the little hangar mountain thing. And he's like, all right, we're not going to let them get away with this. You know, I've been completely useless this whole movie, so let me do something interesting for once that actually has some real consequence and weight to my character and an impact to the survival of the people we're trying to help. And then the other girl, I can't remember her name, just flies into him because doesn't want him to kill himself. So she crashes into him, which could have killed both of them. And also prevents him from blowing up the gun, which potentially leads to everyone else and back there getting obliterated. Makes sense. And if that wasn't dumb enough, the reason is because, you know, we're not going to win by killing the bad guys. We're going to win by saving what we love. So it's this really ham-fisted, kind of force-fed, oh, love conquers all message, and that's a trite, tired old concept in my opinion for movies like this. It's like, just, you know, you gotta kill the bad guys, you know, like that's really what it all comes down to. And you want to put a main character in peril, but you're not willing to get him killed off just yet, so let's just have him kind of have some bogus savior-ish incident, and that way no one gets hurt and they still find a way out. And yeah, it would have been better if he had just actually failed in some way, and maybe she was just happy that he didn't actually die. How about it just work out that way? Not some dramatic, she's crashing into you, risking killing you both, and also not accomplishing your goal. How about he just fails? Because they failed at everything else throughout the movie, so how would that be any different? If all the failure and the 360-degree plot twists, if that's what you want to call them, wasn't enough, all of the things that they've done, the whole plan is completely obliterated because the woman turns the ship around, goes into light speed, and destroys like the whole fleet of ships. So they could pretty much destroy the entire New Order by just doing that. They could use ships as like kamikazes. They could use ships to destroy other ships, or, you know, multiple ships with just one way smaller ship. So yeah, with one fell swoop, they just kind of negated the entire plot of the whole movie and made this whole conflict pointless and unnecessary. And then, of course, the biggest climax of the movie, after all of that happens and they fail to destroy the gun, Luke shows up, turns out he's a hologram. Whoopie-da, you know, we figured it out. Or not really a hologram, he's like showing up in the form of the Force, and you can tell because he's got the old lightsaber and he's younger looking and whatnot. Big twist, everybody. Luke wasn't really there. But even that, like the showdown between the master and the apprentice, so to speak, was inconsequential. He was only there to distract him so that people could get away temporarily. Great job, Luke. You showed up and you were a distraction. That was a good way to have one of our heroes come and save the day. He just comes in, he's a distraction. He doesn't have to actually confront his old apprentice or anything like that, you know. Just come in and say, hey, look over here, while they're running out the back. Yeah. That was eventful. That really got the blood pumping. Oh, I couldn't wait to see what would happen there. And then from there, like the whole subplot with Kylo and his conflict, which in my opinion is probably the most interesting aspect of this whole story arc in this trilogy. He's so inconsistent. Now, I understand he's supposed to be conflicted, but, you know, I mean, come on, man. Like, 1 minute he's doing one thing, next minute he's doing another. And then it kind of builds up to a moment that's promising, you know, like when they kill, what's-his-face, the ugly dude, and then they fight off the guards, which was so lame because why is it that they can use the Force when they're fighting each other, but then when they have like little minions they have to fight, suddenly it's just a duel with lightsabers or weapons of some kind. There's no Force that exists anymore. He's Force choking people and sliding people around and moving objects around and doing all kinds of stuff that he needs to do. Both of them are. And then when they get to this like 2-on-10 fight, suddenly it's just hand-to-hand combat and the Force doesn't exist until they need to move a lightsaber again. Maybe there's an explanation for that. I think it's probably just because it's suspension of disbelief in order to accomplish conflict and peril that's really, you know, doesn't make sense within the universe and the way things have been set up. But in any case, I think what really could have saved this movie in terms of its plot would have been Rey joining Kylo and his proposition, because there wasn't really much discussion there. He's like, you know, out with the old, in with the new, we could start up a new thing or whatever. And it's like, of course, maybe he's evil and stuff, but if she really believes that he saved her, he killed his dark master dude. So, like, shouldn't there be some promise that you could ally with him for a better future for everyone? Like, maybe the next movie would have some conflict about whether or not they should kill everyone in the New Order or kill the rebellion, you know? It would have made more sense for them to try and join together because that's what they both want. He wants her to turn towards his side. She wants him to turn towards her side. So would it not make more sense to have a fair compromise where they join forces and then the tug of war that they were experiencing in battle suddenly becomes a philosophical, ethical tug of war that of course translates to some of the battle that's happening in the real world throughout the galaxy. So it's just like the whole movie goes nowhere. Like literally nothing happens throughout the whole movie. Every single plot and arc comes back around to a failure of some sort or just a stalemate. So you start in the beginning with the rebellion trying to escape the New Order. I keep calling it the New Order. I hope I'm right about that, but I could be wrong. So if I've been calling it things the wrong name this whole video, then oops. But basically in the beginning, you have the New Order chasing the Resistance, and then at the end, you have the New Order, who has a new leader, which is Kylo now, I guess, chasing the Resistance, and no one's really changed. Like, nothing's actually happened. Some people died, but of course, no one's ever really gone. And that's it, you know? Some people died, some people lived, and we end the movie pretty much in the same state that we began it. So yeah. All those issues aside, I actually enjoyed it. It was an enjoyable viewing experience simply because it was just like a dumb action-adventure movie with some hit-or-miss comedic elements, and it wasn't Star Wars. This is the Avengers in a galaxy far, far away. So that's my impression of it. I didn't expect that I actually might enjoy the movie to some extent, so yeah, pleasantly surprised. And it does kind of, like, you know, to kind of come back around to my initial point about the Star Wars Episode 9 teaser, it does kind of give me hope for seeing the next one, because now I see that I shouldn't be expecting a Star Wars movie. This is just some random action adventure movie with comedic elements and a plot that goes nowhere, so we're just kind of along for the action. We just want to see what gets blown up, who gets blown up, so you just kind of turn your brain off and watch some fun explosions in space happen. Maybe episode 9 will be a fun watch just simply for that fact. It's not really Star Wars. The end.